Have you ever looked at a world map and wondered why some countries, like the United States, Canada, and Australia, are symbols of wealth and stability, while so many nations in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia are still struggling with poverty, corruption, and chaos? It's a question that can keep you up at night. Was it just bad luck? A roll of the historical dice? Or maybe, just maybe, it was something far more deliberate? The uncomfortable truth is that this global inequality wasn't an accident. It was by design. To understand our world today, we have to rewind the clock and look at how the game was rigged from the very beginning. Let's start with the concept of colonialism. When European powers set sail and carved up the globe, they weren't on a mission of charity. They were on a mission of extraction. For places like the Congo, Bolivia, and Indonesia, colonization meant one thing: being turned into a massive resource extraction zone. These weren't nations being built. They were piggy banks being smashed open. Think about it. The land was stripped of its most valuable resources: gold from the Americas, rubber from Africa, spices from Asia. And it wasn't just minerals and materials. The most brutal extraction of all was human beings, through the horrors of the slave trade. The entire purpose of these colonies was to enrich the mother country, the metropole. They were never, ever designed to become prosperous, independent states. They were designed to serve. The wealth of London, Paris, and Lisbon was built directly on the poverty of Lagos, Lima, and Saigon. But hold on, you might say. What about the United States, Canada, Australia? Weren't they colonies too? Yes, but they were a completely different type of colony. This is the crucial distinction that changes everything. These places were settler colonies. What's the difference? In an extraction colony, the colonizers are like temporary managers. They come in, take what they want, and plan to eventually go back home. But in a settler colony, the colonizers weren't planning to leave. They came to stay. They saw the land not as a temporary mine, but as a new home. A New England, a New South Wales. Because they intended to stay. They built societies that mirrored the ones they left behind, but improved for their own benefit. They established schools, but for their children. They built roads, railways, and legal systems, but for their own commerce and governance. They created economies designed for long-term growth and prosperity, but only for themselves. The settlers, of course. This land wasn't empty. It was home to vibrant indigenous populations. The dark side of the settler colony model is that the native peoples were seen not as subjects to be ruled, but as obstacles to be removed. Through disease, warfare, and forced displacement, indigenous populations were systematically exterminated or pushed to the margins of society. Their lands seized to make way for this new European society. So, you have two fundamentally different blueprints for colonization. One is designed for short-term plunder, the other for long-term settlement. One leaves behind a shell. The other builds a new house on stolen land. Now, let's look at the infrastructure left behind. In a settler colony like the United States, the railway network was built to connect cities, farms, and factories, creating an integrated national economy. Contrast that with a typical African or South American colony. Look at a railway map from the colonial era. What do you see? The lines don't connect major population centers. They don't create a national grid. Instead, almost every single railway line runs from one place to another, from an inland mine or plantation directly to a coastal port. The entire logic of the infrastructure was to facilitate extraction, to get raw materials out of the country and onto a ship bound for Europe as quickly and efficiently as possible. It was never about connecting the people or building a cohesive nation. The same story applies to education. In settler colonies, public education systems were eventually established to create a literate and skilled workforce for the new nation. But in extraction colonies, education was extremely limited. The goal wasn't to empower the masses. It was to create a very small, local elite comprador class who could speak the colonizer's language and help run the day-to-day administration of the colony. These were the tax collectors, the low-level clerks, the intermediaries. This system deliberately left the vast majority of the population uneducated and unskilled, making them easier to control and exploit. And then there are the borders. The modern borders of Africa are perhaps the most tragic and enduring legacy of this era. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European powers sat around a table with a map and a ruler and literally drew lines, carving up a continent they barely understood. These artificial borders paid no attention to existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, or natural boundaries. They split cohesive cultural groups into different countries and forced historical enemies to live together within the same newly formed state. They planted the seeds of ethnic conflict, civil war, and political instability that continue to plague the continent to this day. So what happened when these colonies finally gained their independence in the mid-20th century? They weren't starting from a level playing field. They were starting a race 50 laps behind, with their legs tied together. They inherited nations with no internal economic integration, only export-oriented infrastructure. They inherited populations that were largely uneducated. They inherited political systems and borders designed to divide and conquer, not to unite and govern. And who took power? Often, it was that same small, Western-educated elite that the colonizers had created. Their mindset was often aligned more with their former colonial masters than with their own people. This paved the way for decades of corrupt, authoritarian rule, where new leaders simply stepped into the shoes of the old colonial governors, continuing the system of extracting wealth for a small few at the expense of the many. These newly independent nations remained economically dependent. Their economies were still based on exporting one or two raw commodities, cocoa, copper, oil, to their former colonizers. This made them incredibly vulnerable to price swings on the global market. And whenever a popular nationalist leader tried to change this system to nationalize resources or build up local industry, they often faced immense pressure, or even covert intervention, from Western powers who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The game was still rigged. So, when we ask why the United States, Canada, and Australia succeeded, the answer is brutal and simple. They weren't developed. They were built. They were designed from the ground up to be prosperous European offshoots on land cleared of its original inhabitants. And why did so many nations in the global South fail? Because they were never meant to succeed. They were built to be service stations for the global economy, mines, plantations, and labor pools. Their systems were designed for extraction, not for development. The shadows of this history are long. The patterns of wealth, extraction, political instability, and economic dependency are not ancient history. They are the lived reality for billions of people today. Understanding this design is the first step to imagining a world where it can finally be dismantled. If this perspective gave you something to think about, if it connected some dots for you, please don't just let the algorithm bury it. Hit that like button to help spread the message. More importantly, drop a comment below with your thoughts. I read them all, and if you want more deep dives into the truths they don't teach you in school, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.